Ugandan army. And he says, I received my cows, here's his cows, from, look at those cows, those beautiful, what are they, Ankole cows with those horns? Yeah. I received my cows from His Excellency Paul Kagame day before yesterday. I am now officially Inkotanye, which I understand means in Kinyarwanda, that's the name of the party, the ruling party in Rwanda. You know, so this I find sort of fascinating because it's a very traditional way of organizing authority. You know, this giving people cows in exchange for loyalty or in exchange for who knows what, and you know, and many aspects of the way the state works in Rwanda are actually based on traditional mechanisms of authority and kind of reciprocity. So one of the biggest programs that President Kagame uses is this so-called imihigo. He uses this imihigo, but the imihigo is again, it's like a pre-colonial mechanism for people make promises and then they have to deliver on the promises and like sort of reciprocity. So what I find fascinating about this is just, this is on Twitter, so you learn all sorts of interesting things on Twitter. That was my remark yesterday. I think like this is something that if you look at Rwanda from an outsider, it's very difficult to understand how the state is so incredibly effective at implementing policy. And it doesn't do it in the way that I think most economists or most people who talk about state problems with state capacity, whatever, in Africa, they don't do it in the way they're supposed to, but they do it in a very effective way using all sorts of traditional mechanisms. That's my understanding. So actually at the moment, with a colleague, we're trying to get the data on imihigo on these imihigo contracts, which starts at the village level, and then it goes up to the district, and it goes all the way up to the state in Kigali to try to understand just exactly how these promises and commitments and reciprocity works. But we haven't managed to get the government to cooperate with us yet. It's very complicated to get anyone to agree to anything. Everyone tends you somewhere else. So anyone has an idea about how to get data in Rwanda, I'm happy to hear it. Okay, so now just to sort of remember a little bit, you know, the main agenda today is, yesterday, you know, we started trying to talk about questions that we thought were interesting. Often they start in a very haphazard way. You know, they start with a tweet, sort of, you know, and you look at that, and I looked at that, and then I thought, wow, you know, could I study how the Rwandan state works kind of in reality? So there's a question. I don't know how to research it exactly, but we're trying to get data. But I think that's where good questions come from. Good questions come from sort of everywhere, from reading the newspaper, from walking in the street, to looking at Twitter. But then you need to take that and you need to move it towards something more social scientific, okay? So I think we deliberately used these 3 studies yesterday, which we personally have found sort of inspiring in our work, but all of which are kind of far from the type of paper that you all probably aspire to write, or the AERC aspires, you know, AERC scholars to write, okay? So today is more the sort of transition from the type of things we were looking at yesterday to empirical studies which have more kind of structure, more systematic, with kind of hypothesis testing, although we don't exactly get there. We'll see by the end of today. Okay, so you know, so here I'm just sort of writing here saying, like, many questions, at least it seems in my history, come from, you know, what we call apparently anomalous variation, you know, in a dependent variable. Like, how come the Lele and Bouchon are so different in terms of economic development when they're so similar in many other dimensions? Okay, there's the puzzle. Or why is agricultural policy bad in Africa when the continent ought to have a comparative advantage in agriculture according to basic ideas in international trade theory? Why is governance in the south of Italy so much worse than in the north when they're part of the same country, speak the same language, they're all Catholic, they're all from the Catholic religion, they all have the same political institutions? So all these questions have the same kind of structure, which is there's some anomalous variation in the dependent. Why is it anomalous? Because so many things are held constant in the background, you know. So it's a puzzle. And then, you know, what does an explanation look like? Well, then we start looking for maybe something that isn't constant in the background. But the fact that lots of things are constant helps you do social science inference, of course. Okay, and that's the performance of marketing boards. Marketing boards are all the same, but they behave differently because of the distribution of political power in society. The differences in technology, agriculture between the Lele and Bouchon, but that goes back to political centralization. And then right at the end, we saw Putnam. That's not a story about political institutions at all. It's a story about, you know, what he calls civic community or social capital, which is something to do with the way people relate to each other in society. Professor Bautista is going to talk more about how we measure that. It's a little mysterious how you measure that. And I think something we were just talking about actually in the car coming to the hotel today is like, how do you measure that in Africa? You know, how do you think about what Putnam calls associational life in Africa? You know, I guess our sense is that that's something very different from Italy, very different from the United States, very different from, you know, England, where I grew up, or very different from Colombia, where Professor Bautista grew up. You know, so I think, like, from your perspective, it's a great opportunity to kind of think about, when she talks about what social capital is, like, how does that work, you know, in Uganda or Kenya or Tanzania, or what does that look like? I mean, we don't know the answer to that, but I think it's great to discuss. Okay. Right. So, and you know, what can you learn from a case study? Well, there's no standard errors. You know, it's difficult to know. You can't test the hypothesis. I think it's evidence. Everything is evidence. But we want to test hypotheses. We need to, you know, we need standard errors in some sense. We need to do inference in a kind of social scientific way, and you know, and so just thinking about those case studies and thinking about how to generalize or how to turn them into an empirical project. So, you know, if you think about Putnam's study, you know, even if I can measure social capital coming, you're going to see that, and the discussion yesterday shows that while it might be true that in the south of Italy social capital is lower, economic development is lower too. And the government doesn't work well. So how do you know what's causing what, right? That's always the problem in social science. You know, even if variables correlate, what's causing what? Okay, so it's a very good statement of, it's a very clear example of, you know, the challenge for Putnam is going to be, how do I show that it's social capital that influences governance and not just the level of economic development? Okay, so that's an absolutely classic kind of problem of inference in social science. You know, the Kuba and the Lele, or the Bouchon and the Lele, you know, how do I know that the difference between the Kuba and the Lele is really due to this historic creation of a state on one side of the Kasai River? I know it isn't due to Belgian colonialism or what President Mobutu did. Okay, so there could be lots of differences between those two different societies. So you need to think through that in a sort of systematic quantitative study. Or to go back to Bates, you know, how do we know that his story is right? How do we know that it's really farm size that matters for collective action and see? At the end of yesterday, you know, Professor Bautista was showing that, oh gosh, you know, he completely forgot about women, but it turns out that half the cocoa farmers in Ghana are women. You know, the women run the markets all over West Africa. Women don't have the same interests or, you know, or preferences as men do. So there's all sorts of things that are missing from that story, that Bates' story, or potentially could also explain the same facts. Okay, so this is just to say, you know, these are just some of the reasons why we need econometrics and some kind of more systematic approaches to try to disentangle alternative hypotheses, to try to know what's causing what. Okay, so let's start by going back to Bates. And do you start now, or do I keep going? Why don't I finish this, and then you can start with Casara's paper. Okay, so let's just go back to, let's take it in turn. We go to Bates and then Douglas and Putnam, and we ask, you know, okay, so let's start with Bates's idea and his argument. How do we turn that into something more systematic empirically. Okay, so you might say, okay, we'd like to test the idea that, what's the obvious hypothesis from his book? It's that agricultural policy depends on the distribution of farm sizes. So if you're going to, if you have a lot of farms, if you have a lot of smallholders, like in Ghana growing cocoa, then agricultural policy is going to be worse because smallholders can't influence the marketing board or can't influence the government. Okay, but so that you could test. You could have a test. You could have a test. You could collect data on the distribution of farm sizes. You know, the distribution of farm sizes across country, agricultural policy. But then you see immediately, oh, the sample size is going to be very small. Okay, how many countries in Africa can I do that? Who has marketing boards? Anglophone countries have marketing, but I don't know if French colonies have marketing boards, actually. I don't know if Côte d'Ivoire has a marketing board. I don't think the DRC has a marketing board. So immediately you have, if you thought about the cross-section, if you just thought about how many countries do I have in Africa where I could get data on the distribution of farm sizes and agricultural policy, you can see that's very few countries. Okay, so I can't run a regression. Now you might say, well, okay, but I can look over time. We know that agricultural policy is going to vary over time, so I could look over time. But that's difficult too, because typically, you know, if you look at data on the distribution of farm sizes, it's very, very persistent. So there's not much variation. So I think you might think I'm just kind of introducing the Cassara paper, because when you okay, is that my fault? All right. Okay. This is not it. When you look at Cassara's paper, you might ask yourself, why did she do what she did? And I think this is one of the reasons she did what she did, which is that if you took Bates's book and you thought, how am I going to take this case study and turn it into an empirical exercise, the first idea you'd have doesn't work. Okay, that often happens. It doesn't work. So you need an alternative approach, and I think that's how I think about this paper. You'd have to ask her for the real reason.
So what she ends up taking advantage of is of the overlap. Remember that yesterday I explained how in Kenya, for example, it seemed that farmers were able to get better policies, not only because they were larger, the sizes of the plots of land were larger, but it had also to do with the fact that the farmers were also co-ethnics with President Kenyatta. So she tries to, the way she constructs the data set is by looking at that overlap. Like, what are the crops, in which areas they're within the country, so there is variation already within the country, where there is a particular crop, and whether the president is a co-ethnic of the people who grow that particular crop. So we're going to see in detail what's the name of the variable and the way she constructs it. But she takes advantage of like that statement by Bates. And in comparison, so one way of thinking about this is like there was ethnic overlap between coffee farmers in Kenya, for example, and President Kenyatta. But in Ghana, the cocoa farmers were not co-ethnics with the president at the time. And therefore, they wouldn't, there was no overlap for the cocoa farmers. And that would allow for more variation, because there is variation within the country. And that's the source of variation that she tries to exploit that will make her regressions to work. And then, so that's, I'm basically explaining the explanatory variable, right? Like that's her independent variable. But I think before we started this, the introduction of the variables and how she constructed, maybe it would have been good to discuss a little bit more, like, obviously the motivation that she has is based on the Bates idea, right? Like what are the decisions that politicians make in order to decide which are the agricultural policies, or yeah. So here, what I would rescue as a motivation as well is trying to understand whether it is true that co-ethnicities also means that you favor your own people. And what it's the finding, which is interesting, is counterintuitive, because she actually finds, so I'm telling you already the finding of the paper and why this is interesting. What she actually finds is that people who live in the areas that coincide with the ethnicity of the president seem to have higher taxes, or seem to have to pay higher taxes, given the crop that they are growing. So they are facing a higher extraction rate by their own co-ethnic, which is very counterintuitive, right? Like, that's a surprising result, because you might have thought that if you are the co-ethnic of the president, you get better treatment in different dimensions. But what she finds is actually the opposite. So, sorry, that was a parenthesis that maybe I should have mentioned before we started the paper. But now let's look at how the way she builds her dependent variable. So she takes, remember that we discussed the power of the marketing board. I guess this is one way of looking at it, or capturing it with data. So she constructs the variable tax n, which is basically, it is 1 minus the nominal, the domestic price of whatever you're producing is smaller than the market price. So that translates into that tax n, the main explanatory variable that she has, will be 0 if the world price is equal to the domestic price, obviously, because it will be the same. So 1 minus 1, it will be 0. And then that means that the closer this tax n is to 1, the heavier the taxes these farmers are facing. And if this number is negative, then the farmers are receiving a subsidize. And so she managed to compile data for 5 types of crops in 30 countries. And at the end, she ends up with a 50 crop country combination, because obviously some countries don't grow all the crops. So it cannot be exactly like 5 multiplied by 30, but not all, because not all of the countries grow all the crops. The data is from 1970 to 1987, which is exactly more or less the time period that Bates was studying this phenomenon. And she also proposes an alternative measure, which is tax R, which is, it has the same logic, but it does not include the marketing or transportation costs, but it goes a bit further back and a bit further later, from 1966 to 1995. And again, this is 1 minus the producer price divided by the world price. And again, these are the attempts of someone trying to capture what Bates put in his theory. In the paper, you will find the complete table, descriptive statistics, but this is basically the result. Like, when you plot the median tax n for countries and crops covered, you see the list of all the countries, and the median variable for each of the crops. So, for example, for cocoa, it's clear that every single country that produced cocoa, because it's positive, and we see that all of these farmers faced heavy taxation, in Congo being the highest. For coffee, the Central African Republic was facing a heavy weight in the taxation with 0.61, while countries like Guinea, Liberia, Cameroon were actually, and Cote d'Ivoire were actually being subsidized. So that's, I guess, coffee was subsidized in some countries, and groundnuts were subsidized in Guinea, and tobacco was, but I mean, from this part of the table, we can only see that tobacco was grown in Malawi, and it was actually being subsidized. But other than that, what we see is that in most of the countries, all of these crops were basically, or the farmers who were growing these crops were heavily taxed. And in a way, that's illustrating already with numbers, which is something that Bates didn't get to with like real data, how heavily these farmers are being taxed and the incentives that these farmers face growing these crops. Now, she actually, so I discussed the explanatory variable first, and this is the name she gave it to that match between ethnicity of the president and ethnicity of the people who grow the particular crop is going to be executive match, and it takes the value of 1 when the president's ethnic group comes from a major crop growing region and equals 0 if it does not. And it is also 0. It takes also the value of 0 when, obviously, when the crop doesn't match perfectly or it's dispersed all around the country, or in the executive you have also a lot of variation and it's hard to match the ethnicity of the executive with the particular crop. There's another type of match that she builds, which is coalition match. Based on a larger ruling coalition of the people who are in power. But at the end, she mentions it, but she doesn't use this in the main results that we observe in the paper. Now, this is a conversation that that we should have. We can start. So, would anyone like to, I mean, you can read the slide, and I guess we're already posing, like, we want to give her credit because it's one of the papers that tried to test empirically collecting data and running regressions and like James said, like having some standard error to make some kind of correlation claim. I guess you wanted to aim for a causal claim. But here, for us, we wouldn't think she's making a causal claim. And why is that? Because both the tax, the way she measures the extraction rate or the taxes that these farmers are facing, tax N, and executive match, they are both endogenous. It's hard to tell what is causing what, right? Or there are other variables, other omitted variables that we are not aware of that might be correlated with both of these measurements. Good, okay. So one of the ways to deal with those omitted variable problem is to include country fixed effect, right? So because that would allow for capturing factors like less state capacity. And because sometimes states have less capacity, they are less able to go and tax farmers. But that is not captured by the crude measure of tax N, because that's actually formulated at the national level. So it's very hard to capture how efficient or capable the state is at collecting revenues at the local level when it's something that is done at the national level. What is the other way of thinking about this? Sorry, that's me thinking out loud.
Yeah, I mean, this is just stories about what can go wrong.
Yeah, like, but in the empirical model, I mean, so what could go wrong, and why is it that she included the country fixed effects? So I mean, we're criticizing her. We can criticize her later, but I guess this is one way of, like, why is it that she does this empirical strategy with country fixed effects? These are the potential sources of no, the potential problematic or problems that she might have considered in order to plug country fixed effects. So that could be one way of trying to deal with all of the biases that all this omitted variable could bring to the regression. And then you cannot say for certain that your coefficient is unbiased. I guess that's what I want to get to. So this is even though she doesn't write down the regression in the paper, which is something that whenever you write a paper, I'm sure, I mean, I don't know why I'm saying this. It is that I teach political scientists, and for some reason, they don't like to write down the equation that you estimate. Economists have that good practice, but she doesn't have the equation in the paper, but you sort of infer that this is the equation that she's estimating. So tax n is the main dependent variable, and it is explained by the executive match, whether the president matches the ethnicity of the main crop growers. Then you have the country crop fixed effects, and the XCT are the time-varying country-specific covariates. So she includes other things that she thinks are relevant, and we're going to see which are the other variables that she included in the regression in order to try to assess for alternative hypotheses or things that might have affect also the tax n variable. So here are the results that she has. And again, what is surprising is that in the areas, or in the country crop areas, that there is an executive match between the president and the crop area, where the area where the crop grows. Farmers face higher taxation, and in the first row, for example, it's up to 23 percentage points. She also includes whether there is, whether the elections are contested in that regression, whether there's a black market premium, and GDP per capita. So, and the results are somehow robust to different specifications. So if you can see it, I mean, for some reason in the second column, the coefficient changes a lot, but and I don't see what. Because okay, so she's using another dependent variable, yes. But other than that, when she uses tax n, the results are quite robust in terms of the size of the coefficient and its robustness. So I guess she can say confidently that this is a strong result, and now she has to go into the job of explaining why is this, how can we interpret this, right? Can anyone think of, like, are we all satisfied with this regression, or could we, do you think there's something that could have been done better, or do you have any question on this estimation? Okay. Another important point that it's interesting to show is that, so she does the following. She includes the dummy of executive match, whether there are contested elections in the area separately, but she also introduces this interaction between executive match and contest. And I guess it's in a way to capture how democratic or how much political competition there is, even though you have the same co-ethnic in the area where your crop is growing. And here what you see is that the coefficient is negative and statistically significant in the two regressions that she plugs that interaction. So what is interesting here is that it seems that democracy seems to bring the amount of tax that these farmers face down, which is, I don't know if you remember yesterday I was telling you the story about Colombia. Like Colombia is also well known for producing coffee, also for having very small landowners, but they seem to be favored with very good policy, agricultural policy. And the explanation that Bates offered is because they were swing voters and the political parties were always fighting for their votes. And how do you obtain the votes of these coffee growers? Well, it's because of that political competition, basically. So I guess you could interpret that result in the same way. When you have to capture votes, you tend to make better concessions, or you tend to give away something better to the people, and then you get less taxed in the particular crop that you have. So I already said this. So again, in a counterintuitive way, where you have a co-ethnic president and you're growing one of these crops, you face higher taxes. The results are robust in different specifications, even when you use a different dependent variable, which is tax R. And then in the interaction between executive and contest, the more democratic the African country, the tax seems to go down. Okay. I already said this. So why, so this is in the slides already, but what could be an explanation of why you're more willing to plug a tax to your co-ethnic instead of giving them something? Or why do you think this, how could you make sense of these results? If this was your paper, how would you explain it?
Have them in your pocket, just to say, like they'll vote for you whether you increase the taxes or not. But for the other ethnic communities, you have to somehow entice them, you know, somehow give them a better deal so that you actually entice them to also vote for you. So that's how I'd explain it. But also given the area of study, it could also be because of formality and informality. Like the area, maybe it is easier to tax people in that area because the formal institutions are already there, as opposed to distant areas or far-flung areas where you have to really have a lot of manpower to actually tax them. Yeah. Thank you.
That's a point that I don't know. I guess. Okay. So Cecilia, you made that's an excellent contribution. Thank you. So yes. It's easier to tax the people that you already have the support from. That's exactly Kimulis Casara's argument. And you have to sort of win the support of other people who are not your co-ethnics. So you are willing to tax them less in order to have their political support. Although I don't know if I mean, I guess her results show exactly that. But I don't know if by offering less taxes to different agricultural crops, that immediately translates into political support. That's something that's another idea that you could test, like the opposite. And then it's your second argument. That I forgot. Yes, so. I think that's an excellent point that she doesn't mention. Like maybe you be in the areas where you have already more state capacity and it's easier to raise those taxes. But maybe that's sort of captured by the country crop fixed effect. But I guess there are lots of aspects that might not be captured by that fixed effect, right? Like you could think of different variation or omitted variables that could be showing those like the way institutions work that are not captured by country crop fixed effects. Okay. So exactly. So she thinks that leaders are confident about the support of their co-ethnics. So it's easier for them to put the burden on them and extract whatever they think they can. Also, you also mentioned this. There's some kind of benefit of feeling that you are represented. If your co-ethnic is in power, you're willing to pay higher taxes because seeing a person who belongs to, that represents you and you feel strongly identified, that's sufficiently good enough for you to be willing to say like, I'm okay with and pay more taxes because he's part of my, I don't know, what I believe or what I represent, and then I'm okay with that. They put more value on that. Or it could be the case that they are facing higher taxes, but at the same time, that executive co-ethnic is giving you away other compensations like jobs or public works in your area. So she, for example, starts with this example of Mobutu and Gabadolid having all of this infrastructure, or giving you subsidies for the particular crop that you're or fertilizers or other ways to deal with the heavy taxation. So yeah. Now, who has heard of the bad control problem? Okay. This is when we criticize her work, and it gets tricky because this is when we want to push you to take these practices into consideration when you write your own papers. So variables like black market premium or GDP per capita are endogenous, meaning that they can be either correlated with the outcome variable that she is trying to study or with the explanatory variable that she is trying to propose as the main explanatory variable. And when you control for those type of variables, you're sort of overdoing it in a way, and that's why it's a type of bad control problem, and this is the way Angrish and Pinsky call this way of controlling for factors that are correlated with either the dependent or the explanatory variable, or they're capturing more or less the same. And so be mindful of the variables that you want to control for. I understand that in a lot of papers you're pushed to think of what are the omitted variables that you are not capturing in your main explanation, but sometimes in the rush of thinking or when they force you to think, come up with ideas and then you plug these variables, but then you have to think carefully of what are the variables that could be better practice to capture exactly what you're doing. Or if your explanatory variable could be, or I guess what you have to be very convinced about is that your explanatory variable is doing a great job at offering an explanation. And then you go through different robustness tests, like the one we would like to suggest, for example. What would be best practice in her case would have been to control for time effects that could capture like common shocks. So maybe in world business cycle depression might lead to systematic changes in the executive match and the taxes, but I mean this is not, I guess you would have to try to see how is it that time effects can be important to try to capture all of that. But ideally you should include the variation in time and how different shocks affect the explanatory variables and the dependent variables. Okay, now it's James' turn. something that I missed? Yes.
I could say a few things about that. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the Bates, you know, when you read Bates's book, you sort of see why, well, it's a case study. So Kenya has better agricultural policy. Why? Well, there's an argument about farm size, and then there's an argument about this match between the ethnicity of the coffee growers and the president. But how do you know it maybe one of them is important and not the other one, or maybe they're both important? Or so if I just compare Ghana and Kenya, or Ghana and Nigeria and Kenya, it's difficult for me to disentangle those two effects, you know. So I think you might think maybe the simplest story is just this ethnic match, and then she finds the opposite, in fact. So one way of interpreting that is to say, well, actually, Bates emphasizes much more the farm size, and maybe that's the right channel, because we do know that agricultural policy in Kenya was much better than in Ghana. And it can't be explained by the fact, according to her regressions, it can't be explained by the fact that President Kenyatta was Kikuyu and the coffee growers were mostly Kikuyu. So it must be something else. So maybe Bates was right to emphasize farm size. So one thing you could do, actually, I was thinking when you were talking, is you could look for heterogeneity. You know, she looks at this interaction between executive match and the extent of democracy in some sense, and finds that when there's more, you know, there's more political competition, there's more democracy, the impact of the executive match goes down. But you could also look at farm size or something. You could look at heterogeneity. So I said the problem with the size distribution of farms is, you know, it's pretty constant over time, and we don't really have good data on it either. But the fact that it's constant over time or only observed in a cross-section is fine if you're interacting it with something which is time varying, like the executive match. So one interesting exercise, which actually would sort of bring the paper back maybe towards what Bates was talking about, which I don't think anyone has done, is actually to look at heterogeneity by land inequality. So that was my thought. So I think, you know, I think this is just the start of a discussion of like how to do, you know, how to kind of approach an empirical project and what kind of things to worry about and what strategies are there for dealing with that. So tomorrow there's going to be a lot more about that, and we're going to talk about some sort of canonical empirical strategies, and this is the first time it sort of comes up, you know, and the way she deals with that is these crop country fixed effects, which I think it's not a bad approach, actually. You know, what is she, when she says, you know, when she does that, what is she doing? You know, she's worried that some sorts of crops are just harder to tax, you know, than other crops. Like some crops you can smuggle easily, or maybe they're grown by the border. And, you know, like in Sierra Leone, for example, yesterday, Marie-Angelica with Professor Bautista was showing you this data, how when the marketing board started taxing people, the amount of coffee and cocoa it grew went down very rapidly. One of the reasons for that is that it's all grown in the south of Sierra Leone, right next to the Liberian border. So it's grown in a part of the country where it's very easy to smuggle it out and sell it in Monrovia. So you know, sometimes the geography can influence your ability to, you know, to smuggle, or the crop could affect your ability to smuggle. Tomorrow we're going to see that gold is much easier to smuggle than coltan. You know, you might not be surprised to hear, because gold you can just put in your pocket, you know, or whatever. Coltan's more bulky. It's more. You're going to see that tomorrow. So that and you know, and countries differ. You know, some countries have a lot more state capacity, and that means that they find it easier to monitor, more difficult to smuggle. You know, easier to tax. So there's a lot of omitted variables there. So the way she does this is to put these fixed effects in, and I think that's you know, what do you have to assume for that to make sense? You have to assume that whatever it is that could generate these problems of inference, all this endogeneity, it's constant over time. But by putting the crop country fixed effects, what she's doing is she's looking basically at the variation, you know, within countries, within a crop. So looking at cocoa, you know, within Ghana, and then looking at in Ghana when there's a change in executive match, what happens to the tax on cocoa? Or within Côte d'Ivoire, also cocoa, let's say, but not pooling that with Ghana, but looking at within Côte d'Ivoire and in Coco, when executive match changes in Côte d'Ivoire, what happens to the... So it's sort of the interesting question, it seems to me. Like at the end, the variation she uses is like the interesting variation. So I always think like, so you can tell stories. We have some stories on the slide, so I think that's good exercise to sort of read the stories and think about it. But you always have to, you know, if you want to criticize somebody's work for having an identification problem or whatever, you need to have an argument. You know, like last week, I can tell them about when I was at Stanford. Last week, I gave a talk in Stanford, and I gave a paper, and then my discussant hated my paper, and he criticized my identification strategy, you know. But he didn't have an argument for why it wasn't true. He just had a kind of ideological, oh, I don't like instrumental variable regression, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, okay, blah, tell me the story. What's your argument? Tell me where's the bias? You know, like, give me a story. So I think, you know, one should be critical, but you have to be constructive. Like, if I'm going to tell you, you know, your paper is not identified, I need to give you a genuine argument, you know, not just like, I don't like your paper. So I'm just, you know, like I'm telling you, I'm making my confession here. Okay. So I think, okay, good. So that's we're going to talk a lot more about, you know, these research designs, and I think, you know, the bad news is, you know, is that there's problems of endogeneity or whatever. It's social science. You know, I can't run a regression of tax n on executive match and estimate it with ordinary least squares and claim that I've estimated the causal effect of executive match on tax n. But the good news is that there's a bunch of strategies, you know, for dealing with that. And she uses maybe the simplest possible strategy. There's more sophisticated strategies, but there's only a few. And I think, you know, by the end of the 2 weeks, you'll have heard all of the strategies and you'll have seen all of the strategies in action. And I guess that's one of the places we'd like to go. You know, you want to ask a good question, you want to take the question, you want to turn it into an empirical project, you want to worry about these basic problems of inference, but there's a bunch of strategies, maybe 4 or 5 maximum, for dealing with that, okay? So that's, you know, science is hard, social science is hard. So, you know, you have to, I said yesterday, the most important thing is to have a really good question. And once you have a good question, you answer it the best you can, you know, and that's how science proceeds. Okay, so that was, so Professor Bautista was talking about how, you know, go from Bates and turn it into an empirical project. Okay, so now let me talk about Mary Douglas. You know, this is a personal story because Mary Douglas and also the book by Jan van Siene that I briefly discussed yesterday, The Children of Woot, inspired me and my collaborators, Sarah Lowes, Nathan Nunn, and John Weigel, who you'll see other research by during this class. It inspired us to go to Kasai and investigate this Lele-Bouchon difference, okay? But like Cassara, that's a great paper. I really love that paper. But, okay, how do I turn that into a real research project? Okay, I could go and I could collect income on Lele people and the Bouchon people and compare the difference, but that's a bit boring, you know, like, because she already sort of said the Bouchon are rich and the Lele are poor. So I could go and collect some data and I could show she was right, but like, so what, you know? So that was our first idea, and then we thought, like, that's boring. That's never going to go anywhere. Okay, so we need a different question. Okay, so we spent a lot of time getting that right. You know, sometimes it's not easy. You sort of feel this is a super interesting context. It's fascinating, but what's the right question? How do we think about that? And I guess we started thinking about, you know, and it's also going to be very difficult to sort of tell anything. You know, there's so many things going on. You know, yesterday when I talked about political centralization, I talked about how, you know, the Cuba, there was reorganization of agriculture. You know, they introduced all these new crops from the Americas, chili peppers, maize, you know, whatever, cassava. Men had to marry younger, polygamy was abolished. You know, there were all sorts of changes going on. So it's not, you know, it's very, like, how do I look at part of any of that? Okay, so what aspect to focus on? And I think this is a very common problem doing research, that you get you have to decide what to focus on. And I think in the end, just discussing this, we decided that what was most interesting was this incidence of state formation, like how to think about political centralization. Yeah, it had all sorts of consequences. So we can't say, it's had all sorts of consequences, but let's focus on one that we think is particularly interesting, and that's on the impact of states on people's kind of behavior or their social norms. Okay, so in social science, there's not so much in economics, but in sociology, there's a big literature about how the emergence of political institutions like modern states created different sorts of citizens. Now, you could say one of the most famous books is by a sociologist called Eugen Weber. His book is called Peasants into Frenchmen, and it's about how the creation of the modern state in France basically took all these disobedient people who didn't really think of themselves as French and turned them into French people. I mean, the African example of this would be Tanzania. Like if you look at the Afrobarometer, where people are asked this question, how do you identify? Do you identify, as with your particular ethnicity or with the country? Okay. If you look at Tanzania as a complete outlier, so in the Afrobarometer on Tanzania, far more people say they identify with the nation state, with Tanzania, than with their particular ethnicity. Okay. So why would that? Well, that has plausibly something to do with what President Nyerere did. That President Nyerere tried to, this whole Ujamaa, is that the Ujamaa? He tried to eliminate these tribal identities and create a sort of sense of national identity. So that may be, I don't know, I had a Ghanaian student who tried to research that once. It's a difficult thing to study again. We could talk about that. It's a great project. But that would be one example which might be similar to this, where there was a real project to try to create a national identity, and there wasn't an attempt to sort of exploit tensions between different groups. Okay, so that's what Weber, I pulled up some slides. This is from his book. And you'll see in a second why this is connected to the Lele and the Bouchon. So this is from early in the 19th century, and it's evidence on what he calls a lack of patriotism, or as reflected in attempts to avoid military service. So here you see in the south of France, this is Corsica, the south of France. This indicates draft evaders and self-mutilation, loss of fingers, and this is just draft. So people mutilating to avoid serving in the French army. Okay, and this here is tax evasion. So this is capturing basically tax collection. This is this is showing you that in the south of France there was less tax collection. So his idea is, people evaded the rules. They didn't like the rules because they didn't see the state as legitimate. So, and then in the 19th century, all of this disappears. Okay, so everyone starts identifying with the French state, and they start paying taxes, and they obey the rules, and they're willing to fight in the military. So I guess what we were interested in here is taking this Lele and Bouchon, which seems to be about something which is happening in Central Africa, and saying, actually, this tells us something about a really big, interesting general question in social science, which is, what's the impact of states on citizens? What's the impact of states on people's social norms, on their willingness to obey rules? Remember what Mary Douglas said yesterday about the Lele, which is that anyone with any knowledge of Lele society knows that there's no one who can give an order to somebody else and expect to be obeyed. Okay? So maybe that's like south of France in the early 19th century. And that's something that changed as the state emerged. So I'm just trying to give you a bit of the kind of intellectual history of how we thought about this. We made analogies between this Cuba case, which seems to be something very specific in Africa, but for us seemed to be something extremely interesting because it was like a kind of natural experiment in political centralization. That's the argument I made. Okay, so this is one of, yesterday I talked a little bit about there's two ways to think. I mean, there's two ways we tend to think about this African materials. One is we can use it to ask a big question in social science. It has nothing to do with Africa. It just so happens this is happening in Africa, but the question is completely general. Or we can look at something which is much more specifically African, okay. So that's the idea, all right? So okay, but that sounds great, but how do I study people's norms, or how do I study the effect of state institutions on norms? Okay, there's obviously an identification problem here. The great American sociology Talcott Parsons wrote about how states emerge in society with particular sorts of people. Okay, but that's where the natural experiment is so powerful, because if you believe the natural experiment, then the Kuba and the Lele were very similar to start with. And then the Kuba experienced this process of political centralization. So it can't be the culture that creates the state. And if cultural differences, if there are indeed cultural differences, they must be a consequence of the state. Okay, so that's where this natural experiment comes in handy. So here, imagine I showed that, I showed in the correlation that places with more centralized political institutions, people were more likely to obey the rules. I don't know what's causing what. I don't know if in some societies, in some cultures, people obey rules, and that makes it easier to create a state, or the other way around. Okay, so I don't know what's causing what. Right? So that's a classic social science inference problem, just like with Putnam. What's causing better governance in the south of Italy? Is it the fact that south of Italy is poorer, or is it the fact that social capital is lower? Okay, so we have but it's the argument in this paper, and you're going to see there's absolutely no complicated econometrics whatsoever in this paper. The argument is, yeah, but we have this natural experiment, okay, and that means that the biggest challenge, which in some sense is this reverse causality from culture to political centralization, that's kind of ruled out by this argument of the children of Woot. Okay, all right. There's also, that's the reverse causality. You could say there's also omitted variable bias. That's what Professor Bautista was, what should I call you? Professor Bautista? That's what Professor Bautista was talking about. What's an example of omitted variable bias in this context of thinking about the impact of the state on people's social norms? Well, some countries like Congo have a lot of natural resources, and there's an argument in social science that if a country has a lot of natural resources relative to national income, then those types of places tend to have very weak states. You have what's called a rentier state. Okay, that the government doesn't need to develop a fiscal system because it has all this wealth from oil or copper or coltan or whatever it is. So you get weak states in this context of natural resource wealth, and maybe in the context of natural resource wealth, then people's income is determined by these resources, which are kind of inelastically supplied, independent of people's efforts and investment. There's little incentive to develop norms of obeying rules in that context. So you can easily come up with a story of omitted variable bias, which is trying to show, arguing that, maybe you find that states like the center, how would I map that into this Kuba-Lele context? Well, you could say, why did the Lele have, let's imagine that we find that the Lele people don't obey rules. That's what you'd expect. You're going to see that's not what we find. So just like in Kimuli Kasara's paper, she found something which was different than she expected to find. You'll see we found something very different from what we expected to find as well. But what you'd hypothesize from reading Vancina and Douglas is that Lele people don't have a state, and they're much less likely to be willing to obey rules. Okay? But you could tell a omitted variable bias story by saying, oh, maybe there's just a lot of natural resources on the side of the Lele side of the river. Okay? Well, how would I address that? Well, that's balance. We have to look at covariance. That's the way we do that. Okay, so does that make sense? So this is just talking through these empirical challenges. There'll be a lot more of that. Okay, all right. Okay, so that's, I already said this. Okay, so that's that's where, you know, that's where this natural experiment comes in. But none of these arguments rule out some of the things I already mentioned, and I'm going to tell you some of the kind of measurement strategies we use to look at this. In particular, so imagine that culture's held constant, and it can't be culture that created the Kuba state. And imagine I find today, you know, there's systematically different types of behavior between Kuba people and Lele people. How do I know that has anything to do with the centralization of the state? Maybe it's to do with the way the Belgians treated them, or the way President Mobutu treated them, okay? So one way of thinking about that is to say, well, that's just part of the mechanism, you know? Like a lot of research you're going to see in the next 10 days, there's some exogenous variable, there's some independent variable, and there's some dependent variable, and there's a lot of things in between. And the way the empirical study goes is by, let's look at the kind of ultimate independent and dependent variable we're interested in, and then let's look at the things in between. And the things in between, we could either think of them as being a sort of channel in between these two variables, and that's where this bad control problem comes up. I can talk a lot about that when I talk about colonial origins. You know, or they could be an independent interest, you know. It could be that if Kuba people behave differently, it's because President Mobutu treated them differently. Why would President Mobutu have treated them differently? Well, why did you know, Milton Obote treat the Kabaka of Buganda differently? You know, because the Buganda state was a massive threat to President Obote. Okay, at the time of independence in Uganda, the Kabaka had constitutional authority. You know, you see that everywhere in Africa. In Burkina Faso, you know, the Mossi Kingdom had constitutional authority at the start. Think about President Nkrumah and Asante. You know, the Asantehene was an enormous political challenge, a political threat to President Nkrumah. Okay, so maybe the king of the Kuba was a political threat to President Mobutu, and he had to be dealt with. Okay, in the same way that, you know, the Kabaka ended up in exile because the post-independence politicians in Uganda were afraid of the traditional authority of the Kabaka, right? So like you can think of reasons why President Mobutu might have treated the king of an independent state differently from the Lele, who were much easier to manage politically. Okay, so that could be what's driving it. I'm going to try to convince you it's not what's driving it, but you could say, well, that's okay. You know, that's just part of the story. It's still an interesting story. It says that, you know, one of the reasons Africa, the way Africa is today in this specific context is, you know, the differential treatment of you know, different African peoples by the colonial. I didn't talk about the Belgians, you know, or I'm talking about President Mobutu. Okay, so I'm going to try to, we try to convince you in the paper when you read it that this is not the real story, but you know, why? You know, well, because I think the simplest story is the most interesting story, like for me personally, but I think it's sort of, that's a subjective issue. You might think the really interesting story is how, you know, like in Uganda, how, you know, I don't know if anyone's researched this, but, you know, the fact that, you know, you had these very different levels of political centralization within Uganda. You had presidents like, you know, like Idi Amin or like Obote, who came from the north, from much less politically centralized societies. And when they came to power, then they had this very antagonistic relationship with the more politically centralized societies. I don't know if anyone studied that kind of actually empirically in Africa, post-colonial Africa. It would actually be a super interesting topic, you know, why it was that, you know, these northerners came to power. You might have thought that the political power was in the south. That was the more prosperous part of, I'm trying to talk about Uganda. You're going to tell me I'm all wrong, but that's fine. So I'm just sort of giving you some intuition as to why this might be interesting to think about. You know, of course, it's interesting how the colonials worked, and, you know, but that all of this stuff is hard to measure also. So I think like one of the most interesting parts of the paper where we had to become more creative was figure out how to measure these things. Like, it's okay to say, okay, President Mobutu might have affected the Kuba and Lele differently. How do you know? You know, how do I measure that? You know, he didn't mention it in his diaries. You know, like, how do we know that? I'll tell you how we did it. You might not believe it, but anyway, we had a go. You know, so okay, sorry, I'm talking too much. All right, so back to Okay, so remember, just remind you that I'm going to go a bit more detail now into the children of Woot. So remember, Woot was the mythical founder, and here were his children, the Lele, but there's also what Vancina calls the central Kuba, of whom one group was the Bouchon. Okay, so Mary Douglas just compares the Kuba and the Bouchon, and but there were other Kuba groups. Okay, so these groups here, the Piang or the Bulang or Bieng or Ngindi, they're all sort of living in that area which I showed yesterday, it's called the Kuba Kingdom. They're all Kuba peoples. They all trace their ancestry to Woot. Of course, the kingdom integrated other people that Vancina calls peripheral Kuba, who were not descendants of Woot. And, some people like the Kete, for example, are clearly completely unrelated. They speak very different languages. They don't speak this Mongo, Southern Mongo. And, the Lulua, who are related to the Lunda, who come from Katanga and stuff. So just to say, in the regressions, the simplest thing in the regressions is to compare the Bouchon and the Lele, but I'm also going to show you regressions where we just compare the Kuba to the Lele. But we're not going to, what we're going to make a distinction is between the central Kuba and the peripheral Kuba, because the natural experiment only really applies to the central Kuba, who are all the children of Woot. Okay, so I think there's a lot of cool stuff to be done. I think this is more or less the first empirical paper where someone exploited some of this African oral history in a systematic way. So there's so much to be done on this topic. Okay, so here's the sample. What did we do? What did we do? Well, you might think, okay, so imagine you read Mary Douglas's article and you decided, that's a really cool article. I'm going to go and collect data on the Lele and the Bouchon. So how would you do that? Well, you go to Kasai, and here's the river. Here's the Kasai, here's the Sankuru. This is just, the boundary of the Kuba Kingdom. And I go to the river, and I start interviewing people on different sides of the river. It's logistically a bit complicated. There's no roads in Congo. It's tricky. That was our idea, not going to work. Okay, what do we do? We went to Kananga. Okay, so here's Kananga, the capital of Kasai. It's not inside the Kuba Kingdom, but we thought the only way of doing this practically is to collect data in Kananga. Okay, Kananga, it's a fun place. It's a city of 1 million people with no electricity and no running water, but it's very quiet. There's no cars, You get a good night's sleep. I love Kananga. Okay, so we started interviewing people in Kananga, essentially, and looking for Lele and Bouchon and Kuba people in the city who'd basically migrated to the city. So you're already thinking, oh, that's going to cause a problem. Like people who migrate, they may not be similar to people who don't migrate. So there's an issue of sample selection. But here's the sample we ended up with. Okay, so this is about 500 people we collected data from. So the Lulua were the most. We had 80 Kuba people. We had 44 Lele people. Okay, so here's the breakdown. We all have we have some Tetela people, which from the east. That's President Lumumba was a Tetela, and so you have all sorts of people, and even this was a challenge because the first thing we did was we took a random sample of 1,000 people in Kananga. We got Google Earth and we divided the city into kind of little regions, and then we randomly sampled. And we had 5 Kuba people. so that didn't work. So then we had to have some focus groups, and we asked, okay, so where do the Kuba people live? Oh, they all live in this neighborhood by the railway station. Okay, so people tend to live all together. So then we had to do a stratified sampling where we oversampled. We randomly sampled, but within particular neighborhoods, so we got enough observations. Okay, because what we're really interested in is, I don't really have you could say, oh, but couldn't you have a hypothesis about all these people? Yeah, you could. I mean, if we knew enough about the political history of these different groups, we talk a little bit about this in the paper. You could have a more general hypothesis about the relationship between political centralization and behavior. And we did actually, there's an appendix where we actually did quite a lot of data analysis on this. If somebody's interested, I can talk about it. But But, but what we're going to do mostly in the paper is compare the Kuba to everybody else, and then, but comparing the Kuba and the Lele, or the Bouchon and the Lele, within this Kuba 80, there's, I don't know, I think half of them are Bouchon. That's the sort of simplest comparison. So you might say, that's 80 plus, that's 124 observations, Kuba and Lele, 124 observations. Like, can you run a regression with 124 observations? Like, when I go to seminars, we go to seminars in Chicago, everyone loves talking about big data. This is a big data paper. This is a small data paper, okay? So I think that's fine, it's fine. If you've got a good question, people are interested. There's statistical techniques for dealing with the fact that you only have 124 observations. Yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was thinking, why the 80 versus 44 instead of having a balanced sample?
Why is it 44? Because that's what we got. So we did this stratification. So we focused on some neighborhoods where we found that Kuba and Lele people tended to live. And then we randomly sampled from those, and that's what we ended up with. That's where we ran out of money. Actually, what we did was we did 2 ways. We did 2 summers in a row. We did one summer, we had about 250 observations, and then we went back the next summer to get another 250 observations. And the interesting thing was, we ran the regressions with the first sample, and then we doubled the sample, and the results were exactly the same. So then we stopped. But we could have, if we kept going and collecting data, we could have expanded that. But this is so the reason we only have 44 Lele is that that's what we found by randomly sampling from these neighborhoods. Yeah, so I think it's very important there's different ways of sampling. Like there's this technique called Snowball Sampling, where, if I find you're a Kuba person, then I ask you, tell me about, other Kuba people, but that's regarded as much less attractive as a sampling strategy. So random sampling is the most attractive sampling. So that's what we stuck with, and that's what we got. So we could have increased that, if we just kept on collecting more data. But as I said, we ran out of energy and money.
Because I was thinking, if you had to make comparisons, across the different lines, so you have 44, and you're comparing to 2 people somewhere. For example, the Shockwave, there are only 2.
Yeah.
So
we can't say much about Shockwave. That's just too small a sample. So we're not. Mostly, you're going to see in the regressions, we put all of the non-Kuba and non-Lele into one category, basically. We don't try. I'm saying potentially there's a lot of interesting things to say about these different people, but we know much less about the political history of the Bindi. The Luba, of course, we know a lot about the history of the Luba. Luba people had a very elaborated central state. There's also a fantastic oral history of the Luba people, So one could do something interesting on the Luba, but here that's not, we just kind of lump them together. I'm just throwing that out there just to show you how rich the information is in some sense, but we didn't use that, yeah. Okay, so all right, and so what this map shows you is people's home villages, So we asked when we asked people about their ethnicity, we surveyed them, we asked them about their home village. Okay, so here you see, these green triangles are the Lele people. This is Ilebo on the river. Some of them are actually on the other side of the river. Interestingly enough, they self-identified ethnically as Lele, but they said that their home village was on the other side of the river. The red are the Bouchon people. Some Bouchon people came from over here, no idea why. And then these are the other ones. These are the Lulua or whatever, the different ethnicities. And some of them, there's a lot of Kete people here, for example. But the Kete people were integrated into the state. So that makes perfect sense. But we don't treat them. As I say, they're kind of culturally very distinct from the children of Woot. So we don't. That's not the main interest. So this is just. So here. That looks pretty nice to me. It would be nicer to go in the bush and collect the data in the bush, but it's very complicated to do that. And we're going to see tomorrow when I talk about this work that Sarah Lowe's and Eduardo Montero did, looking at colonial rubber concessions in Congo, they used a similar strategy, which is, let's go to a city where there's migrants and we survey the migrants, and then what about this problem of selection, of selective migration? Well, we collected a lot of survey questions to try to control for that. Okay? There's always problems, you know, there's strategies for dealing with problems, and you know, you do, as I say, like my sense is people are willing to accept problems if the question's interesting enough. Okay, so I think that's, you know, like that's the way I interpret this, but of course that may be not completely objective, but okay. So I've been talking loosely about the impact of states on citizens, you know, on President Nyerere's policy in Tanzania, on people identifying as Tanzanians and, you know, not with their ethnic group, okay? But I've been a little vague about what that means, so let me get more concrete now, okay? How would I measure people's willingness to obey rules, you know? Being English, I'm very conscious about this. You know, English people are obsessed with being polite, you know. So I know that I have to be polite. So I have to, and in the United States, I have to anticipate not putting myself in a situation where I have to be polite and do something I don't want to do, you know, because if I get into that situation, because I'm British, I have to be polite, you know. So why do I have to be polite? That's just the way I was brought up, you know. My mother was very obsessed with politeness. It's very important. So just giving you an example of like what we have in mind here. Like people have these sort of internalized social norms, you know. English people have to be polite. But how on earth would I measure something like that? How would I measure someone's willingness to obey the rules, which is what I was talking about earlier? Well, I could do it with survey questions. So I could do that. You know, I could ask people about, you know, do you think it's bad if people disobey the rules, or how bad is it if people don't pay their taxes, or whatever. So I'm not going to talk, we have that in the paper. I'm not going to talk about it because I think that's probably the least interesting piece of evidence. The main strategy we use is something called the random allocation game. Okay, so this was something developed by experimental economists, actually by a Swiss, very prominent Swiss experimental economist called Ernst Fair. And it's a game, I'm going to describe the game, which gives you kind of material incentives to cheat. You know what the rules are? You can cheat, and you know you can get away with it. But using simple statistics, I know how much you're cheating. Okay, what on earth do I mean? Okay, here it is, all right? So we went to Congo with a lot of dice that looked like this. 3 sides black, 3 sides white, okay? And the idea is you get a Kuba person and you put them in a tent. Why put them in a tent? Well, because when we first started doing this, you know, we weren't doing it. We trained 10 Congolese people to collect the data for us. So they would go, you randomly pick someone, and then, you know, you collect survey information. So we collected like baseline survey information, and then we got them to play this game. But, you know, people are hanging out in the street, there's lots of children around, you know, you start playing a game with someone, suddenly there's 10 people, 15 people, 20 people, and that you don't want, because there's a lot of evidence that social pressure influences the way people play these games. So what we did is we bought a bunch of tents, so people went in a tent. I should have put a photograph of the tent, and then it didn't cause a fuss. You know, they were in the tent playing the game, and they liked the tents, it turned out. So here's the dice. What do? You're in a tent. You think, here's the rules. You think in your head, okay, I'm going to roll the dice, and if the dice comes up black, I win. If it comes up white, I lose. Okay, and if I win, I take some money, 1,000 Congolese francs, like $1. If I lose, somebody else gets the money. Who else? Well, we played around with that. The local government, someone from Kananga, a co-ethnic, so different people, okay? But, so here's the idea, you know, you do this, sorry, it's 100 Congolese francs, not 1,000 Congolese francs. So the total amount of money at play is 3,000 Congolese francs, it's about $3 US, which was twice the median wage in our baseline survey. So in the baseline survey, the median wage, was $1.50 a day. So it's a very, very poor place. And you have to do this 30 times. Okay, you roll the dice, 100 Congolese francs. I win, I pick a color, that's the rules. I win or I lose. Okay, you're in the tent. And then what you do, you play the game and you come out and you have 2 envelopes. And you keep one, this is what I won, and you give the other back to the researcher. Okay, so I'm outside. I don't know what you're doing. Okay, you could just be lucky. You could win every single time and you come out and you say, you know what, I won every single time. Your envelope for you is empty. I take all the 3,000 Congolese francs. Fine. Okay, no problem. Off you go. Okay, so, but how likely is that statistically? Okay, so we know that if you roll the dice, the probability you're going to win is a half, right? The 3 sides white, 3 sides black. Okay, so in expectation, it's very anomalous, if you won all the money. And in fact, on average, you should take half and you should give half to the other people. Okay, so the idea here is that you could take all the money, no problem. No one's going to stop you. You could just walk away. We can't see what you're doing, okay? But we know, on average, people should give half the money. They should keep half and they should give half the money to something else. So that's what we use to see to what extent people are like deviating from kind of obeying the rules. All right, that's the game. I'll show you the results. Everyone cheats, including Swiss undergraduates and University of Chicago undergraduates. And okay, and the third thing we used is something we noticed in a pilot. So we did different sorts of behavioral games. I don't know if people teach this stuff at the AERC, but it's very popular. It's very popular at the University of Chicago. We have some very prominent behavioral economists. And there's a very famous game called the Ultimatum Game, which I didn't write there, which I should have done. Okay, so here's how the Ultimatum Game goes. I have some money. I have 1,000 Congolese francs, and I get to divide it between myself and somebody else. Okay, like Professor Bautista, and she gets to say yes or no. Right. So imagine I get all the money, 1,000 Congolese francs. I say, okay, I get to keep 900 and you get 100. And she says yes or no. If she says yes, I get 900, she gets 100. If she says no, neither of us get anything. Okay? So the purely rational economic outcome here is I have all the bargaining power, if you like. I just give her a little bit and I keep most of it. Okay? But when real people play that game, if I try to keep most of it and I give her a little bit, real people say, no, that's not fair. We have notions of fairness, okay? And in fact, typically the most common thing is split 50-50, okay? I keep 50, I keep half, you get half, and then she says yes, and we split the money, okay? When people try to behave too selfishly, then the other person says no, okay? So this is how the ultimatum game goes, okay? So we played the ultimatum game with these people in the tent. Okay, so how does it go? They go in the tent. They have 2 envelopes again, remember? So one envelope is for themselves, and one envelope is for something else. So imagine you're going to play the ultimatum game with somebody else, the government of Kananga. Okay, so you have to decide how much do you keep for yourself, how much do you give to the government in Kananga. And we put them in the tent, and they just divide the money, and they put it in the envelopes. They bring the envelopes out. Now what do we do? Well, the way you do this properly is you actually have to go to a real Congolese person working in the government and say, somebody made this division, yes or no? Do you accept it or not, right? So you can't just pretend, you have to do it. And if that person says no, that's it, you lose the money. So what we noticed, what one of our Congolese collaborators noticed, was people were stealing. Right? So you're in the tent, you're putting the money in the envelopes, you know that this other person may say no and you're going to lose the money. So there's a temptation to stick some in your pocket. So not from the other person's envelope, but from your own envelope. So what he noticed was people basically instead of leaving the money in their own envelope, they'd put some in their pocket. Okay, so that once we realized that was happening, we actually collected systematic information on it because it gives a completely independent measure of like whether people are cheating or not. Okay, so that's how we measured this. Okay, and you know, these again just playing against different people, a co-ethnic. You know, so if we're doing a Cuba person, you know, you do the random allocation game, you know, or the ultimatum game, you'd be playing against another Cuba person, just, you know, a citizen of Kananga or the provincial government, you know, or we were just ambiguous about who the other person was. Okay, so what I'm emphasizing here is, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know, you know, I don't know if you're playing by the rules at all. You might be just completely cheating, but all I know is there is a rule, and under the rules, on average, half the money should be allocated to the other party. Okay, so what does the data look like? Remember, what's the hypothesis here? So in the Casara paper that Professor Bautista talks about, the hypothesis was, you know, when you have a co-ethnic president, you should be taxed less. And she found the opposite. And that's basically what we found here. Okay, our hypothesis was Cuba people had this very elaborate central state institutions. You see, well, if you read the paper, what do you mean if you read the paper? When you read the paper, you'll see we emphasize a lot these judicial institutions. So Vancina wrote extensively, they had this very elaborate judicial system, the Cuba Kingdom. They independently invented trial by jury of your peers, they had appellate courts, the whole thing. So that's one of the reasons we emphasize a lot this rule obeying. Okay, so rule obeying, so the hypothesis is that Cuba people should cheat less. Right? They've been under this centralized state, socializing them into obeying rules. After all, think about what the state did. The state abolished polygamy. It got young men marrying earlier. You know, this was a big deal. Okay? What do we find? The opposite. Here's just the Cuba compared to everybody else. Okay? So if I just take the 80 Cuba people, like all the Cuba, Bouchon and the other central Cuba, and here's how much on average they give to other groups. Okay, now you can see that everybody's below 1,500. Remember that 1,500 is what you should be giving on average, so everybody's cheating a bit. Okay, but the brown is Cuba, and you can see that, you know, particularly with respect to the government, the gray here is like the average amount that all the non-Cuba people in the sample give to these different people. So co-ethnic, money to government. I always have this problem with tribe. You know, the Congolese, you know, talk about tribe. Actually, they don't talk about ethnic group. They talk about my tribe. I don't know if people in Kenya but in America, you can't use that word. So Africans use the word, but in America, you have to say ethnic group. But here, for some reason, tribe snuck in. So I apologize for that. But what's fascinating here is that actually the Cuba people seem to cheat more than anybody else. Okay, completely the opposite of what we thought. If I break it down between these different ethnic groups, I don't do this very much, you can see the Cuba cheat more than the Lele. In fact, they cheat more than everybody. Okay, so the people who had these distinctly more centralized political institutions are the worst behaving people in this sample. Okay, I talked about this, you know, and this is the same thing everywhere. You know, this is just talking about the ultimatum game, and you know, 5%. I talked about this, but 5% of all people cheated, like stole at least once, but 10% of Cuba people stole, and they stole more also. Okay, so how do I? So now you know, I'm in Kananga with my tent and my dice. I don't know what happened to the dice, actually. It's probably some kids playing with it in Kananga. I'm going, actually, after we teach here, I'm going back to Kananga for a few weeks. We have some new projects. But how would I take all of that, you know, and turn it into a regression? Okay, so here's the regression. We have two dependent variables in some sense. One is, you know, how much do you offer to the other person in this random allocation game, like the offer to the other person, or how much do you steal in the ultimatum game? So we can think about that as kind of dependent variables. And the only independent variable here is whether or not you're Kuba. You know, we're going to look at different samples. You know, you could say the Lele versus Bouchon is like the real thing. But the simplest thing, you know, in this thing I was showing you here, is just Kuba compared to everybody else. This is the average for the Kuba. This is the average for everybody else. Okay, so and then, you know, there's individual level covariance. So, you know, you could think about, we collected all sorts of individual stuff on education and whatever. The most interesting thing, I wasn't going to discuss this much now, is, you know, one of the challenges to this identification that I mentioned before is this notion of kind of selective migrants. You know, so who's in Kananga? You know, and so we collected a lot of retrospective information about how long have you lived in Kananga, you know, why did you move to Kananga, or if your parents moved to Kananga, why did your parents move to Kananga? I wasn't gonna, when you read the paper, you'll see there's one section where we talk specifically about this issue of, we tried to convince you that the results are not being driven by selective migration, shall we say. Okay, so that, you know, so this is just, so it's a very simple, this is a simpler model than Muli Kasari estimated. She had a panel data, you know, she had panel data, she had countries across time, you know, she had countries, she had time varying, you know, she had these fixed effects. And so this is very simple here. This is ordinary least square regression. Why does this make kind of any sense? Well, because of the natural experiment. So you read the paper, you see it's that context. We try to convince you at the start that there's really a sort of natural experiment here, and we use a lot of contextual and historical knowledge to kind of make that argument, okay? And if you buy that argument, then by the time we get to this, you're happy for us just to do something very simple, okay? You know, next week, when we talk more about papers with real randomization, there's no complicated econometrics with real randomization, okay? You just compare the means in some sense. It's like, it's just as simple as this almost, okay? So we didn't do a real randomization here, but it's simple because we make this argument about the natural experiment. Okay, so, and here's the regression table, and you know, these are just different columns here depending on what's the comparison group, what's the treatment, and what's the comparison group. Okay, so you could say, you know, the full sample is just, you know, comparing the Kuba to everybody else. Okay, so there's 499 observations. That's the full sample here, and you can see here that this is the dummy for Kuba ethnicity. The Kuba are significantly, the Kuba send significantly less money in this random allocation game. And that's robust, and you get right the way down here, 82 observations. This is where we're comparing. I don't know why there's so few. There should be more observations than that. It should be 120 something. I don't remember. Maybe this is the wrong table. But here, this is the Bouchon and Lele, and you can see that, well, you know, it's not so significant, but the coefficient is pretty similar. You find that this is comparing the central Kuba to the Lele, so this is dropping everybody except the central Kuba and the Lele, and this is just comparing the Bouchon to the Lele. It's negative and significant, and there's, you know, there's a bunch of other stuff going on. For some reason, you know, for some reason, in the second year we collected data. We collected data 2013, 2014. In the second year, people gave significantly more, and which was difficult to understand why. Okay, so this is like, you know, Professor Bautista was saying that the best practice in Kamuli Kasara's paper would be to have like a year, like time effects, like a dummy for every year. So this is basically what this is. You know, this is like a dummy for the second year, and there's some systematic difference here for reasons it's not clear, like why people were generous. One of our Congolese, you know, Jim Mukengi, one of our Congolese, not a collaborator, but a friend of ours in the town, his theory was, oh, you know, some white people show up and they hire all these Congolese people and they spend money. Okay, fine. Next year they come back and everyone says, ooh, they're back. I'd like to get a job with these people. So his theory was people are being more generous because they sort of think that's what we want, that's how we want people to behave, and maybe it helps them get a job, or I don't know. Like that was kind of interesting. That was his interpretation of this. But I don't know if that's true. That was his, yes. Yeah, we should buy real estate in Kananga. It's very cheap, by the way, if you're interested in investing. So I don't know if John and stuff has looked at that since. We could look at that, yeah. And this is just the amount of money missing in the Ultimatum game, and you see, again, less significant when we move it to the smaller sample, but Cuba people are significantly more likely to steal money put it in their trousers in the Ultimatum game. And you could think about other things here, but there's not much. There's gender, there's age, there's not much kind of, there's with or without, this is without covariance, with covariance. It looks looks even better. It actually looks better with covariance. It's more significant with covariance, but that's the sort of story here. Okay, oh my gosh, yes, I have a lot more to say. We haven't got to present Mobutu yet. What time is it?
3:45.
Should we have a tea break? Yeah, why don't we have a tea break? Because you need to have some tea before I start telling you about President Mobutu. How's it? Okay. All right. The translator must be exhausted. The way we interpret this is along those lines. I think it's pretty surprising because you're going to see when we talk more about north of Italy and the south of Italy, in north of Italy, the idea is that particular types of political institutions have shaped northern Italians to have this different culture, to have more social capital. And there's more like a sort of complementarity between the political institutions and the underlying norms, whereas here it's almost like they're a substitute, like the state crowds out norms. So that's puzzling, but why is that? It seems very different from the European evidence, but that's what we found. Okay, so let me just go fast through one thing for 10 minutes because it's sort of fun. And I talked about President Mobutu. So how would we look at whether this result was being caused by President Mobutu? Maybe President Mobutu messed up the Cuba Kingdom, and that's why people are less willing to obey the rules. President Mobutu wasn't probably so good at obeying rules himself. But how would we look at that? Okay, we look at the colonial period, and the way we look at the colonial period, you'll see in the paper, is we try to control for a lot of colonial institutions, mission stations, where colonial officials were located. We kind of created these maps from the colonial period, and we controlled econometrically for the proximity of your village to a colonial institution, things like that. But for President Mobutu, we had to get more creative, and we used what are called implicit association tests. So this is a tool in psychology. If you've never heard of it before, go to this website, implicit.harvard.edu. It's run by some social psychologists at Harvard who developed this technique. And it's designed to measure your kind of almost like your sort of subconscious attitudes towards things and people. Okay, so let me just show, and the idea here is we're going to measure people's attitudes towards President Mobutu. So how on earth would you do something? Well, you do it with a tablet screen like this, okay? So here's two buttons, and here's a happy face, and here's a sad face, okay? And here's a happy face, and President Mobutu is there, but he's just hanging out, not really doing anything, okay? So what happens in an implicit association test is that in the United States, they do a lot of these to look at people's attitudes towards race relations. So like what's people's implicit attitudes, and also gender relations, to measure stereotypes. Like, so for example, if I show you a picture of a woman and a woman and a man, and I show you a sink, what do you associate with a sink? The woman or the man? Okay, so it's sort of looking at gender stereotypes, also looking at racial stereotypes. I show you a white person and a black person, and I show you, like a gun or something. You know, who do you associate with a gun? Okay, but so look at if you've never seen this before, look at the web page. It's pretty fun, actually. It's pretty fun. And I can say that if you're a man, you discover that, you know, that you're sexist. And if you're a white man, you discover you're racist, you know, even though, you know, it's crazy. So it's fun. It's fun. Okay, so all right, so what's the idea here is, forget President Mobutu for the moment. He's just hanging out. The idea is you see a smiley face. Oh, you have to press the button underneath the smiley face. Okay, you match like with like. Okay, so this pops up. Oh, smiley face. I press that. Sad face. Now I have to press on this side. Okay, President Mobutu's not doing anything yet. Okay, now what happens? Oh, President Mobutu comes up. First there was a smiley face, then there was a sad face, now President Mobutu. What do? I have to press the side with President Mobutu. But President Mobutu's underneath a sad face, okay? So the real issue here is, do you associate President Mobutu with sad faces or happy faces, okay? And the idea is that if you associate President Mobutu with bad things, when he comes here and President Mobutu is under the sad face, then you press the button. Yeah, of course, you press the button very fast. But if he appears under the smiley face, okay, sad face, I press here. Now what? Oh, now he's under the smiley face. Ah, President Mobutu, smiley face, doesn't go together. Bad guy. He was a bad guy. He was corrupt, didn't do anything for his country. So the idea here is it's harder to, you hold back. Like, you associate President Mobutu with bad things. Yeah, he's under the sad face. You press the button very fast. Now, it creates some cognitive dissonance, the social psychologists say. You don't associate President Mobutu. So you press the button slower, okay? And the whole thing with the implicit association test is like looking at the relative speed, okay? Looking at the, you know, so here's a validation of the method. So we did this not with President Mobutu. We did it with a lot of things, including King Leopold. I'll talk about King Leopold tomorrow. But food, spiders, and snakes. Okay, like what do you associate with happy face? So think of that President Mobutu thing, but instead of thinking about President Mobutu, think of snakes or spiders or food. Snakes, bad. Okay, snakes are bad. Everyone knows snakes are bad. Snakes are associated with witchcraft and the Garden of Eden, and you know. So what does this thing being negative means? It means that people pressed when the snake was underneath the sad face, they pressed the button much faster than when the snake was under the happy face. Other way around for food. Spiders, you know, not as bad as snakes, but not good. Food, it's the other way around. With food, you press the button under the smiley face much faster than under the unhappy face, right? So this is like just a check on the method. If you look at the website. So this is just how we controlled, we collected people's attitudes towards the Belgians, towards President Mobutu, and we used that as a covariate in the regression. So it's a way of looking at, you know, if President Mobutu had really messed up the Cuba people, and that was what was driving the results, you'd expect to find Cuba people had significantly worse attitudes towards President Mobutu measured like this. Okay, so this is going to come up tomorrow in the Lowe's and Montero paper. So this technique is very fashionable in economics at the moment, and it provided a way of getting at a question which is just super difficult to answer. You know, you could complain about this and we could discuss it, but it's some kind of measurement tool which gives you some flexibility. Yes.
Do you think there could be also some, I don't know what the results are.
Do you want to use that?
Okay. I don't know what the results are, but do you think that the fact that these people, again, with what is socially desirable to respond, what like white people looked at Mobutu as someone who was corrupt, who didn't do good for his people, but maybe Africans have a different perspective, although they know they should respond to what, I don't know. Like, do you think that's an issue or?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I think, you know, like in some sense here, we're taking a very stereotyped view, outsider's view of President Mobutu, you know, as this corrupt sort of dictator. But actually, most Congolese people have a different perspective. Like many Congolese people, there's a very powerful sort of revisionist narrative in Congo that actually President Mobutu created a Congolese identity where none previously existed. You know, this whole Zaireanization, people had to change their names to African names. They had to wear these particular kind of traditional clothes. And so that would be a very different way of thinking about President Mobutu. And in fact, you know, I wrote something for the AERC, which I presented last year, which I think is coming out in the AERC's journal soon, where I discussed this called Tax Aversion and the Social Contract in Africa. I actually discuss different ways of thinking about President Mobutu. So you're right that this is somehow predicated on a very particular way of thinking about President Mobutu. But I guess you could sort of say, however it is people thought about President Mobutu, you know, as long as that you know, it's still sort of controlling for it. Like imagine I have completely the wrong theory of how Congolese people talk to President Mobutu. What really matters here is whether Lele and Kuba people think differently about it, right? But you're right that it's a very stereotyped view of President Mobutu. You know, like I was going to tell you my story about President Museveni. Also, I forgot to talk about President Museveni. You know, like there's very different ways of thinking about. If you look at President Museveni from a Western perspective, you think that guy's been in power for way too long. You know, but maybe that's not the way Ugandans think about it. You know, so okay, good, great. So I'm not going to show you the regressions. I'm not going to show you the regressions. It's in the paper, but these are not in the paper. So they're fun to think about. Yes. What, we're discussing President Museveni? What's this guy called? Bobby Wine. Bobby Wine, yeah, but I like Bobby Wine because he said he claimed he'd read my book, you know. So one of his people reached out to me and we were going to invite him to come to Chicago, but too complicated. But anyway, let's not get into Ugandan politics. Not maybe later. Okay, so that's it for me. But you're right. Oh.
So my question is on the issue of President Mobutu. If you start with him under the sad face, then change it to him under the smiley face, does it change if you start with him under the smiley face and then shift it to the sad face later on? Was there a difference? Or could it be conditioning? Like I've already seen him under the sad face, so
this is, you do this in a sort of random order. So the program does this in you're saying could people learn or something like that? So the psychologists are very concerned about this. Like a lot of the discussion is about, you know, like this is trying to measure this sort of subconscious attitude that you're like not even aware of, but you sort of, you know, like snakes, you know, whatever, or food. So I'm not a psychologist, but the psychologists discuss this a lot. Like, and you know, the recommended thing is, you know, people are not supposed to learn what the right answer is. That everything comes at random. So you randomly, you know, and people get different. You know, there's the computer randomizes the order in which you see things, and it's supposed to capture your subconscious attitudes. You know, and I think that, you know, if you look at that website, there's a lot of things. You know, you can log on to it and do these tests, different sorts of tests, and you see, you know, a lot of them may be kind of too specific to the U.S. culture or whatever. Maybe that's not very good for African culture or African society, but you find yourself. Like I said, you know, my self-image is not that I'm sexist, you know, but the data. So then you'd sort of think, like, I'm anticipating what's the right answer here, whatever. But I still ended up looking sexist. So I think they use evidence like that to say this is really capturing something real, and you can't like play it, you know, you can't. You see what I mean? Like, I think that's, but obviously there's concerns like that, yeah. Yes.
I think that looks like an interesting approach. As we approach the elections, I think I would be interested seeing how the results would be between the two political formations, Azimio and Kenya Kwanza political formation, what the attitudes would look like. No, it was just a comment.
Yeah.
Don't need any,
Yeah. No, I mean, you can use it in lots and lots of different contexts, yeah, to ask different questions. You know, we just thought of using this. We didn't, you know, we wanted to deal with this question about President Mobutu, and we just didn't know how to measure that. And this gave us a way to approach that. You know, you may say it's not the right approach, or that, you know, but that's what we did. I'm giving that's what we did answer. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the question I asked sometime, because see, when you're sampling with primary data, I believe the area you went to, they had governments that could give you the full population, to which you could pick a sample you can generalize, so that when you're talking about the Kuba people and the Lele people. But if you think, because according to that paper, the interpretation of the results is about the Kuba people.
Yeah.
And you only have 80 of them.
Yeah.
Do you think the sampling was enough, adequate? I understand it's a natural experiment, but initially, the numbers that you chose, were they sufficient to say that the results represent the views of the Kuba people?
Well, you know, one approach to this is these sort of power calculations. So there are ways of calculating what sample size do I need to kind of estimate credibly the hypothesis I'm interested in. But it's very difficult to make those kind of power calculations. Typically involve knowledge that you don't have, in my experience. So I think, my basic answer to that is, you know, the results are statistically significant. So if the sample is too small, then, you know, typically you're just going to find standard errors are very large. You don't have enough power to say anything, you know. So I think my basic argument is, you know, is we did find pretty robust, statistically significant results, and that's what it is, you know. Like, there's no reliable census in Congo, so, you know, you have to collect the data yourself, you know, if you want to do what we did, you know, which is get this match ethnicity and collect this survey data and play these games, you have to do it yourself. Yeah, of course. Would it have been good to have 1,000 observations? Or yes, it would, you know, but there's resource constraints, there's time constraints, you know. But, you know, do I believe the results? Yes, you know, and I think that's because we have standard errors and you can calculate those in different ways. And I think what you're concerned about, obviously that's legitimate concern, but the biggest, you know, that I'd expect to find nothing, basically, you know. If we were really, really underpowered, you'd find nothing. You know, why is it that these differences emerge so systematically with a relatively small sample? Well, because I think the differences are real, you know. So if something is really big and, you know, and systematic, then, you know, then you can isolate it with relatively small samples. I guess that would be my defense. But obviously, you know, these are issues, you know, but there's trade-offs. There's always trade-offs, right? So it's expensive, you know, it's expensive and logistically challenging, you know. Yeah.
I just wanted to add something on your response. You see, when you are doing a survey analysis or when you are doing data, you are using primary data collection. What sometimes we have something what we call sample saturation, especially when you are asking a question which is at community level. For example, an attitude towards a certain person, an attitude towards attitude of people from a certain area on a certain politician, or for example, for this case, Mobutu. It is most likely that even if you were to add, you ask 1,000 people, you are most likely to get the same response in terms of variations. So even if you are to ask 50 people, yeah, extracted from that community, it is likely to give you a good indication of the responses that you'll get. Yeah. So it doesn't matter whether you were to add, you ask 1 million people, you'll get the same response, because that attitude is like, it's a community level kind of question. But when you are focused on individual variability, then is when now you have to look at that sample population. You look at the population of the study, and then the sample population, which you derive using the different methods. Yeah. So if it is it depends with the nature of the research question. So it's attitude towards a common. It's something that is, the question is asked at community level. Yeah. Even 5 people can give you a feeling of what the community thinks about a certain issue. That's what I just wanted to add.
And as I say, one of the reasons I believe this, as I said, is we did it the first summer, and you could say, well, that was just like a pilot, you know. And then we went back, and we found these preliminary results, and we went back and we doubled the sample, and the results were exactly the same as they were the first year. So then I guess that's another reason why I sort of believe it somehow. It's very robust, you know, and systematic across these Kuba people. So. And in fact, I'm not saying, it's not in the paper, whatever, but we also did a lot of focus groups with the local people, and there's all these stereotypes which are also about Kuba people, which are consistent. That's not very scientific, it's not in the paper, but I guess it also kind of made me believe a bit the results that if you ask other people about Kuba people, they have these stereotypes which are consistent with those regressions. So, but that's not discussed in the paper. Yeah.
I think something that we haven't discussed a lot is that all of this, so James says like running these regressions is very simple, yes, but collecting the data is very hard, and people should get a lot more credit for the...
They do, that's why the paper is published where it is. Yeah.
Yes, but I guess we concentrate so much on showing how the results are robust and everything is done properly econometrically that sometimes we forget that the data that researchers are using takes a long time and a big team and lots of money and training to do this. But this is not something to discourage you. It's actually something to consider and to make you think of possibilities that you could investigate here and how to do this. And I guess I'm going to talk about Putnam. And I think this book actually took like 15 years or 20. He did research for this book for 20 years. He started collecting data in the 1970s, and then he ended up publishing this book in the 1990s after gathering data about the issues that he cared about for all of those years. So, and this is a book that also is considered one of the classics in political science because he offers an approach. The third chapter offers like we need to start thinking about measurement seriously, and it's not just about like because we have these terms, but no one makes the effort to try to assess governance. What does that mean? And then he came up with this term called social capital, and Robert Putnam is well known for this concept of social capital that we're going to look into detail soon. So, how to measure these two concepts? So for measuring governance, he uses 12 variables, and I'm going to discuss briefly only some of them because there are a lot of variables there. So he wants to understand how good are all of these provinces at governing, but there are different layers of how do they govern. So the first one of the variables is like cabinet stability. He collects data from 1975 until 1985, and I guess the way to think about this is that as in national governments, the state governments or the regions have to organize assemblies where they have to make coalitions in order to decide legislations to promote within the region. So here, the cabinet stability is measuring all of these coalitions that have to be formed in order to promote the different legislations that at the end of the day are going to be turned into policy or laws that are implemented in the different regions. So what he finds is that in the north, for example, on average, it was for that period, 2 cabinets were common, like the number of cabinets that were formed, which implies more stability, meaning there were more stable pacts made on the among the politicians that were in those legislatures or those cabinets. While in the South, there was more instability because they tended to have around 9 cabinets in 10 years, for example, in Sicily, Sardinia, or Campania. So again, this is North versus South. Budget promptness. How long does it take to get approved the annual budget? What is the desirable outcome? To have it approved quite fast, right? Because if you want to have money to start spending for your public good provision, you want to make sure that the national government is sending it to you promptly. So, and then you can start spending, either spending or pretend you're spending it and pocket it for yourself, or spending it in order to provide the public goods. What is desirable is to have it done promptly. So again, he finds that the first region to issue the budget was Friuli, Venezia, and they would do it by January the 27th, soon after the year started. While in the South, it was done in August 7, when the year was almost like half gone, and basically it took them a long time to agree on how is it that the budget was going to be spent. And ironically, like, you might think that you want to get that budget approved, even if you have the only incentive to approve it is to put it in your pocket. But even that didn't seem to be worrying the politicians that were in charge of making this decision. Then, to what extent these different regions adopt the national legislatures or legislative reforms that are adopted at the national level? So again, in the North, it takes them shorter. These are done fast, and they managed to pass, for example, in Emilia-Romagna, 12 initiatives, while in Calabria, they only managed to pass 1 during the period or the year that he gives the example for in the book. The bureaucratic responsiveness is, I think this is the measurement that took him, I guess, the longest to try to gather information on, because he made, and there are other measurements that he makes a lot of follow-up for different years, but this is also the one that is most creative. And I wonder if and this is related very much to the discussion we were having yesterday about the differences that you have in different agencies in the governments. Like, I'm sure, like, again, in Kenya, you must have very efficient agencies like the Foreign Affairs Department. You were saying, Moses was explaining how this department is very effective and rapid and efficient, but there are others that it's hard to get a response. So they did it in the same way. They came up with requests that were not real, but they sent all these 3 requests to the different departments that are noted here. They requested information about 3 issues. So the health department was asked about reimbursement procedures. So someone who was on vacation wanted to know how they could get their expense outside Italy and how to get refunded about their medical accident that they had while on vacation. The vocational department was asked about job training facilities. And the agricultural department was asked about loans and subsidies. And then the idea was to try to measure, and all of this was done by mail, sending letters to all of these departments all around Italy to try to assess how fast, so they tried to measure 3 different things. The promptness, meaning how fast they came back to the letters, saying like, dear Mr. Blah, this is the way we can solve your issue, blah. The clarity and the comprehensiveness. So obviously they wanted to measure how clearly it was the information presented as well. And how easy were the steps that people had to do in order to achieve whatever it is that they wanted to seek for. And then they also, so it was not enough just to say like, oh, these people replied the next week, and these other people never replied. For the departments that never replied, they actually started poking them and calling them on the phone, like, Mr. Blah Blah, we sent a letter last month, we're wondering what is happening. And then they made follow-up of the number of phone calls that they did to the particular department. If they didn't get any kind of answer, they would ask people to show up in the particular office and say, like, look, 2 months ago, I did this request, I called, no one has answered me, and by this time, no one has told me anything about this particular request. So they tried to collect information for a long time, like a lot of follow-ups. And I think this is one of the main aspects of what, like, he gets a lot of credit for that, because no one has done this type of measurement on the quality of the governance or the bureaucratic responsiveness, and it's quite innovative. But that is only one of the many variables that he includes in the index that he ends up constructing as the institutional performance index. So again, they collected information from 1978 until 1985, and this lists the relevant variables that they considered important to try to measure that performance. Daycare centers. I think one might wonder why is it that daycare centers are important, but I think it has to do, like in Italy, it's very well known that communities have organized at different levels to try to promote like that aspect of the welfare state, and you come up with like pedagogical schools like Maria Montessori or Emilio Reggio that are very famous and are actually spread around the world, but these are based on certain pedagogical approaches that involve the community a lot. So I guess I guess the daycare centers are capturing that aspect of like how Italians think about their very young people. How quick statistical and informational services, like usually agencies should be able to produce different statistics in their offices, right? So they went and tried to find out how good were their statistical and informational services. They also looked at industrial policy instruments, local health unit spending, family clinics, the presence of family clinics, and then they constructed this index, which is using principal components analysis. And this is what once they do the weighting that you do when you are doing principal component analysis, this is the order that they get. Meaning, on average, reform legislation seemed to be, so this is organized, so the highest value corresponds to the highest performance for each of these indexes. So I guess reform legislation, on average, most of the regions were quite good at reforming, at adopting the legislation that was proposed at the national level. But for example, local health unit spending or agricultural spending capacity got the lowest scores, meaning on average, most of the regions were not very good at dealing with these two aspects. So here, what is not surprising is that all of these measurements are highly correlated, meaning that, so this is the correlation matrix that associates each of these variables with each other. And what we observe is that the coefficients in a lot of them are quite high, and in some cases statistically significant. But also, I mean, which is good news, because I guess they are trying to capture similar things. But the bad news is, I guess, that if if you're doing something not properly in one dimension, that also means that the other dimensions are not going to be very good. So like all bad things come together and all good things come together.
It's very hard to estimate the good and bad things.
Yeah.
So many come together.
Exactly. So, yeah, but I don't know if there's a better way of, I guess it depends on, like, the way he's proposing the research question is his own, but I guess in the future one can think if there are clear ways of trying to distinguish what this actually means and how can we interpret this or that. But I guess we have to come up with also with different research questions. And this is the way he plots the institutional performance index. So again, so the dark black shows the regions in Italy where the performance was very high, and the white areas were the regions that didn't perform, or that performed with the lowest performance. And there are all these, like, I guess they didn't have colors or sophisticated maps like Professor Robinson presented with his Cuba and Dele people. But you have the different lines, and it's what you can see. It's exactly the pattern that we expect, no? So, for example, at the very bottom of the Italian Woot, you have in Calabria you have the lowest performance. Here again, it corresponds to the second lowest performance, and average performance starts going up here with the diamonds. And the highest are going to be represented by the dark black in the north. So this is more or less a visual representation of how that index looks along Italy, and reconfirming these differences between the north and the south of Italy. Now, he wants to correlate this with economic modernity. So the way he measures economic modernity is by, again, using a principal component analysis and incorporating variables like per capita income, gross regional product, agricultural and industrial shares of the workforce, and the agricultural and industrial share of value added between 1970 and 1979. And what would you expect if you had to run that correlation? It's not a tricky question, and it's written in the slide, and anyone can answer it. You expect that all good things go together, right? So you expect that economic modernity is highly correlated with good governance, or the index of high economic performance. But what does that tell you as well? Like if you start thinking, like in terms of econometrics, what would you say comes first? Good governance, or economic modernity? And that's a very deep question that Professor Robinson has tried to answer in other papers. It's hard to know, right? It's hard to know what comes first. So again, this is work that shaped a lot of the literature in political science and in sociology and in American politics, because they want to believe that they have their own niche in politics. But I mean, we're okay. I mean, and we are very keen and eager to learn from Professor Putnam, but then we also have to question, like, but how do we solve this issue of what comes first? This is the final, like one of the figures that shows exactly that correlation. So again, the correlation between economic modernity and the institutional performance that we just covered is about 0.77, meaning that it's a quite high correlation coefficient. So this is just, again, to show that economic modernity is highly correlated with institutional performance. Now, he introduces like the term of social capital. And again, this is a very significant contribution because I guess no one else had thought about how is it that people at the community level can contribute to improving governance at the local level. So he wanted to assess how is it that associational life and the practice of clientelistic politics or the engagement that people have in politics matter. And what I'm sensing here in the tea break or when we put out there politics in this room, you're all very nervous about talking politics. But I want to think that being interested and being engaged and being active seems to have an explanation also on good governance, because I guess the interest that you have on the way the money that your region has and how they spend it and how is it that they make the decisions, that keeps politicians accountable. And there are other works that have tried to follow on Putnam's work, trying to show that how social capital is highly correlated with other outcomes, but I guess we won't cover those because they are not relevant for this class. But I just want to say that this is a very important aspect of the practice of democracy. I guess that's the point. So let's see. So he thinks that trying to capture voluntarily associations, meaning participation in civic organizations, inculcates skills of cooperation as well as sense of shared responsibility for collective endeavors. And like Professor Robinson said, before I jump to the next slide, and what time do I have to? Okay, we're late. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I'll finish. I'm talking. It's 5 already.
I know. Yeah.
Okay.
You want to finish this if people have 5 minutes, or you could. It's kind of important, so we could start with it tomorrow.
Yeah, we could start with it tomorrow, but I guess. Okay, so I'll say this, and maybe this is a question for you to think about because I'm interested in the answer, and I'm going to be selfish because I want to learn about what you have to say about this. So he decided that the type of associations that are conducive to have higher levels of social capital are the number of sport clubs in the local areas that imply having some leisure time, or cultural and scientific activities, music and theater, technical or economic, health and social services, or other. But the question for you is like, I guess in the African context, obviously you have sport clubs, obviously you have cultural and scientific activities, but I'm wondering if there are other ways in which people associate in Africa that could also be thought as an area of where people come together and collaborate actively to a particular goal. And I asked James this because from our trips to Nigeria, we have this friend, Professor Chimakore, who describes, for example, his age group, how people from his same age group are always trying to collect money to build the pipe to run water from here to here. And they're always trying to or the wives of the village are raising funds to construct a school or raising funds to construct a health center. And in a way, those are associational lives, associational spaces that you have in Africa, but you don't have in Italy, or you might do, but they are not captured here in the type of organizations that he's trying to understand. So again, my question for you is like, can you think of these organizational groups in your country or in Africa that you think we could compare to these ones that he's trying to incorporate? And I guess I can stop here. Yeah, okay. So you're free.
whether it's a comment or a question. The papers that we have reviewed from yesterday, you can see the unique aspect in terms of the methodology that they applied. And I find that that's the missing bit in most of the research papers that we do. Especially, let me say Africa or Kenya. Let me speak for Kenya. Yeah, because I've interacted a lot with a number of studies that we do within Kenya and within the region, in the sub-Saharan region, and you notice that there is that we tend to shy away from those kind of experimental design, and they are the ones that answer most of these interesting research questions. So I'm just wondering how can we move towards that trajectory whereby we undertake such kind of analysis, because as Prof indicated, they are actually time consuming and very expensive, and there are also the other study dynamics, like the controls you need to put into place to ensure that there is no interference with the study design. So that's what I've actually been grappling with. Because we might have nice research questions, but when it comes to now executing it, we can't, because of data challenges or of resource challenges in designing an experimental design or in executing an experimental study. So I don't know how we can navigate this so that we also undertake such kind of interesting studies that are worth studying or being recognized worldwide in terms of the kind of unique findings that you derive from this kind of studies. Thank you.
I think you should answer that. You yourself said how when you got to Kananga first and you started collecting data, you wanted to test these hypotheses, but then you decided that that was not the most interesting thing to do, and then things developed. And you started with a small pot of money, but then it escalated because you were able to shape the question in a way that other people could see, oh, like, oh, this is really interesting, and it's worth funding it. So I guess it's...
Yeah, but I think like this, but we have access to the National Science Foundation.
Yes.
Yeah, so
But I guess in here, I guess that this is when collaboration between scholars is important. Like if we sit down and we come from this room with 3 great research questions, I'm sure there are ways in which we can think like, okay, we can try to get funding for this paper because this is something that no one else has done and we see future. So it's obviously I can tell you the very deep philosophical answer, like don't stop dreaming about your research question and fight for it and fight for it. But that's, like you said, it's very hard. But then we have to start thinking strategically on how to implement this question. So we know of Busara. You were talking about Busara, for example, and they are willing to fund this kind of research. So we know people in that organization. So if we get organized and we set a very nice grant proposal, you might get some pot of money that might lead to another pot of money, and then you're able to implement these ideas. And I think, and then I do get philosophical because you have to fight for that. And if something starts going, you should try to keep going and get bigger and bigger and more ambitious.
yeah, I think it's about finding spaces where like Western scholars and African scholars can get together and talk about ideas.
people spending millions of dollars on nothing, like nothing. I mean, just crazy, you know. So that's, I don't know how you can affect the World Bank's, like, the World Bank, you know, like, nothing, you know, just so, but it just was so depressing sitting in the audience, you know, because that money in the hands of Africans who can ask good questions would be incredibly powerful, but instead it's just, and I complained to him and he said, oh, it's just, you know, it's like NGOs, it's what NGOs want to do. So the World Bank, the NGOs gives money to the World Bank, and then it was sad, really sad. But I think that's a way of, there must be ways of solving that problem of bringing people together. It seems that's the obvious thing to me, like bringing African scholars together, you know, with Western scholars, and you know, that seems to be. But yeah, it's hard. I understand what you're saying. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
And it won't happen now or this year. Maybe it happens in 2 years or in 3 years. I don't know if we'll be back, but okay.
Yeah, we will.
Okay.
Oh,
That's the music.
That's the These guys only get paid to 5 o'clock. Yeah.
Why is it that, okay, in the US, as soon as the class finishes, the students are out of the room.